this is how we start our block. We want to look at the B1 space, and we are going to be stitching on these lines. So that is going to be the back side of your block, and this side is going to be the right side. This first piece has to go right side up, wrong side down, so it's against the paper. What I like to do for this first piece is just put a little bit of glue down there to hold it. And you want to make sure that you're covering all of the seam lines. I hold it up to the light to make sure the glue is sticking. So just enough to tack it down there so it doesn't move, because we don't sew this first piece. The process is to fold on these lines. So we're going to look at B1 and B2, and we're going to fold on the line between those two. And then this is where your ruler comes in, and you just put the 1/4 inch up against it and you cut off the extra. So now when we sew on this line, it's going to be an exact 1/4 inch seam. And then that's where we place the next piece. So this piece is going to go here, but we have to stitch it on. So we're going to line it up, and this block is fairly simple because it is symmetrical, so you can just kind of overhang it the same distance, line up your straight line with the seam that you just trimmed, and then you, some people will pin it. See if I can get a pin in there. And some of these bigger pieces you may want to do that just to hold it in place. So just put a pin through, all the way through the paper, all the fabrics. Just make sure it is straight, nice and flat. Most of the time I'm working with little pieces, so I just grab a hold of them and flip it over. So now we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew down this first seam. Now, some instructions will have you start right in front of the end of the line and you back stitch and then go forward. I like to start outside the seam, so eventually this is going to be a seam allowance over here for these pieces. So I like to start outside the line and I don't do a back stitch. And that holds together any extra fabric that's going to go into the seam allowance. I have a needle down position on my machine, which I like to use while I'm sewing. Also, you want to turn down the stitch length so that it's small enough to perforate the paper, and that will make it easier to remove, to tear apart. So you want a smaller stitch length. Okay. Remove that. I'm going to take this pin out, trim my threads there, and now what we're going to do is press this over, and we have a nice straight seam there. And then take the iron and press it over. Sometimes you want to be careful with the ink that you're using. It might bleed over on your ironing board, but I haven't noticed any problems with that. An optional tool is this water pen, and what I do is I just draw along the seam there, and it puts a little bead of water just right on the seam, and it just helps fold it, and then press it dry, and it gives it a really nice flat seam. Okay, so now we go on to, number 3, B3. So that's over on this side. So we are going to fold over the paper right on that line. Add a 1/4 ruler, so I'm trimming a 1/4 inch away from the fold. And then the next piece is going to go right side down, just like the other one. Right side down, center it evenly across the blue square. You can pin it. I think I will. That seemed to help. It's hard to get through that paper. And then we flip it over. Now, when you're sewing, you could sew it this way, or you could sew it this way, but I tend to always put my seam allowance to the inside of my machine, and then all my project then ends up being over to the left, where you have more space for it to hang out. This is not a big project, but that's just a good habit to get into. Seam allowance to the right, project to the left. And then same thing, we just stitch down this line. I go past the seam about 3/4, a 1/4 inch or 3/8 of an inch, not 3/4, a 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch past. And you'll see as we get to these next pieces why I like to do that. Okay, so I'm gonna just finger press that over. Press it with the iron. Do the water pen. Press again, and I get a nice flat seam. Okay, so now we're going to number 4. So here's B4 up here. And you'll notice that when I go to try to crease the paper, I have stitching here. So all I do is grab the seam on the back and pull the paper away, and it easily comes away. You can see it just very easily tears off. And now I have stitching in that seam, and it lays nice and flat. So that's just my preference to do it that way. So going through the steps again, we fold the paper. Put the 1/4 inch ruler up. Trim away all the excess. Ooh, not much there. And then we add this triangle. Right sides together, center it, flip it over, and take it to your machine and sew down that line. Finger press it over. Press it with the iron. Give it a little bit of water. Be careful you don't melt your ruler. So that's nice and flat there, especially where there's some bulk and overlap of seams. So you've got a couple layers of seams there, so that does help give a nice flat area where the bulkiness is. Okay, this is our fourth triangle for the gold. Center that, flip it over. Make sure it doesn't move since I didn't pin it, and then stitch along that line.